wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain, angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from
All right, so we can recall that we talked at the end of class last time a bit about the opening phrase of verse 41, and he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people. And we made the observation that chapter 12, verse 41 teaches us that God actually cares about these things. The idea, and I've heard it expressed many times over the years, that God doesn't care what we give and that God doesn't need our money is a self-serving doctrine that excuses us from sacrificial giving. What this text is making very clear, if he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people, he did that so he could see what the people were doing. He did care about what they were doing, and he cared about it at a level even deeper than we might consider on the surface. He didn't just care what was being done physically, he cared about the motives behind it as well. And that gets into the principle of this teaching. So it says he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums. And a poor widow came in and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. He called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." All right, so what's the point? I'll let y'all teach the class this morning. Okay, the amount doesn't matter. Conditional upon understanding the rest of it. I don't have a problem with that statement. Okay, it's about your heart. It starts with your heart. It begins with your heart. So, does the amount matter? Well, let me ask it this way. He says that the widow woman did more than all the rest. What would all the rest have had to do in order to do what the widow woman did? Okay, they would have had to be more heart engaged in what they were doing. We have a tendency to think about large gifts as being indicative of someone caring. But the problem is these people were giving large gifts, but they were giving large gifts that made no impact on them at all. They had such an abundance, it was nothing. And it didn't indicate that they cared. In order for the giving to have any value at all, what has to happen? Okay, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth and said that we must examine ourselves and give as we have purposed in our heart. That's where it begins. Every example in the Bible of someone who gives from a heart that is right in its relationship with God gives in what fashion? Sacrificially. This widow woman put in everything that she had to live on. Now, is this setting a standard? Is this saying that I have to empty out my bank account every week? No, that's not the point. The point is that she gave because she loved. Because she loved God. She was concerned about what God said. So she gave according to the will of God. Oh, wait a minute. We read about that somewhere else in 2 Corinthians 8, right? The Macedonians. So as Paul was writing to the church at Corinth and several of the other churches in Asia Minor were involved in this project, the brethren in Judea were suffering, and a collection was being taken up to relieve the brethren in Judea, and he was encouraging them and reminding the promises they had made in regard to that. And then he uses the Macedonians as an example, and he says that the brethren in Macedonia did what? They gave more than they were able. Not only did they give more than they were able, but in fact, they had been apparently discouraged to some extent from doing so. You don't need to do that. And what did they do? The text says they begged to participate. But what's more important about that text is it says they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. It's that process that we need to understand. That what's going on here is not about the volume of the gift beyond the fact that it is connected to the greatness of your love for God and your dedication to keeping His will. And every single incident that I'm aware of in the Bible that talks about giving in a positive light, it is people who are giving beyond what one might expect, not people who are giving less. And yet, what people do constantly is try to use the lack of a prescribed amount of giving as an excuse to do what? To give less. Now, under the law of Moses, what were they to give? Okay, the tithe, 10%. That's what a tithe is a 10%. Now, they actually gave a lot more than that. We could talk about all the sacrifices. We could talk about a lot of other things that they had to give. And the fact that they were told to be hospitable and care for people who were in need, which was in excess of that 10% that they gave. We could talk about all of those things, but we won't. We'll just stick to the 10%. Because what people like to talk about today is, you know, what's not repeated in the New Testament? A command to give 10%. Not anywhere found in there. In fact, as we've already mentioned, Paul wrote to the church at Corinth and said, give as you purposed in your heart. Here's the question. Why is it that everyone always wants to mean that I can, since I don't have to give 10% anymore, that means I can give less than 10%, instead of saying, since I'm not bound by 10% anymore, I can actually give more. They never say that. They never use that as a justification for giving a greater amount. And yet here we exist under a covenant that is of much greater grace and of much greater effect. We need to think about that. And we need to adjust our hearts so that what we purpose in our heart looks more like the widow and less like all the wealthy people who came in giving out of their abundance. Now, who is our judge in this matter? God. Who was the judge in this text? God. Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people, and then made a determination about who was doing it right. And it had nothing to do with the amount that was given, beyond that amount was a reflection of the heart of the giver. A penny was a greater gift from someone who didn't have a penny to give than an abundant gift from someone who had even more. We have to consider those things. And really, this applies to something much, much greater than giving. That's the illustration, is the giving. But what does this apply to? Everything in our service, every aspect of our life walking as Christians, they first gave of themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. If we are not wholeheartedly into the service of God, then our service is going to be lacking. And that's what we need to understand, every aspect of it. What about the public service? What if I sit in the pew and I have knowledge, but I'm not willing to share it? What if I sit in the pew and I have the ability to help lead in the services? And I know that that's a limited illustration because there's some constraints placed on that by the scriptures. But what if I have that ability and I don't do it, not because I'm seeking to serve God, which, by the way, is what someone would be done who would be not allowed to take that role, but not doing it because I'm actually giving my heart to God and constraining myself according to his commands, but instead I'm constraining myself just because I don't want to be bothered, or I don't care about the people that are around me. I don't care whether I edify them. What about the singing? What if I allow the fact that I'm a poor singer to keep me from singing such that I can teach and edify those who are around me? Isn't that what the singing is for? Oh, but I'm embarrassed. They might laugh at me. I honestly knew a man who sounded as close to a bullfrog as anyone I've ever heard when he sang. But I want to promise you this, everybody in the room heard him. And they could be taught and admonished through the things in which he sang. I'm convinced that he went before God justified before many of us who are concerned about the wrong aspects of these things, whose hearts are not fully in it, who are just going through the motions. That's not any more pleasing. And by the way, if we want to go to the Old Testament examples of this, it's offering your blemished sacrifices. That's the same problem. It's building your homes and letting the temple lay desolate. That's the same problem. If we want to go way, way, way back, it's seeing the fruit is the delight to the eyes and is good for food and is desirable to make one wise, and that having more weight than God saying, thou shalt not eat thereof. You notice I use that good King James language there? When God speaks, he speaks in thous and these, right? Don't eat that fruit. Oh, but it looks so good. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. It's the same problem. It's where our heart is. And Jesus taught all about that too. He said where your heart is, also your treasure is going to be there. That's what you're going to hold valuable. And so when we see these folks, these rich people putting in large sums, but they were giving out of their abundance, and it's portrayed as being just an afterthought. No big deal. Here, take this. What you see is someone who hasn't given their heart to God. Someone whose relationships on this earth are more valuable to them than their relationship with God. Because why do they put in the large sums? If their motivation isn't to please God, then why are they doing it? Trying to show off. By the way, a lot of times in our current society, when we give those large gifts, we also do what? Well, I'm okay with the tax write-off thing. We tell people about it. We advertise it. We want our name put on a building or on a brass plaque screwed into a pew. Or in the world, we print up a giant check and we go before the TV cameras and have a press conference. There's an example, and I won't use anybody's name, but a well-known movie actress who wanted to be associated with giving a large sum of money to a particular charity. Made a huge promise, press release, the whole 9 yards. Come to find out in a court case a couple of years later, you find out she hadn't actually given any of the money. It was just a promise. That's why you do that kind of stuff. Much, much better for your heart to be right and you to be actually seeking to serve God in what you do, rather than to gain the attention and the accolades of man. By the way, Jesus taught about that too, and he said, if that's what you're doing and you're seeking the accolades of man, then you better enjoy it when you get it, because what? That's all you get. Any questions or comments about that? Anybody think I'm all wet? All right, chapter 13. Somebody asked me if we were going to get into chapter 13 this morning. I said, absolutely, we may even get through it. That's going to depend on the class. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, look, teacher, what wonderful stones, what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now, this kind of gives a time marker. When you look at some of the other Gospels, we know that this is toward the end, that it's getting close to his arrest and his series of fake trials and his crucifixion. But Mark doesn't go into a great amount of detail about that exchange. What he does do is talk about it in terms of its application. So let's go on. He sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of all these things are about to be accomplished? And I'm going to stop right there, and I want us to notice the questions. Now, it depends on which account you read. How many questions there are here are actually, to some extent, how you break down the text, how many questions there are here. Matthew 24, Luke 21, both parallel texts to this. Most people, when they talk about this, like to talk about Matthew 24. The reason they like to talk about Matthew 24 is because the language is vague enough, I can make it say what I want it to say. A little bit harder with Mark. Mark's pretty clear. And so we're going to look at this, probably not reference those other two accounts too much. We might. But anyway, they ask him this question. Okay, you just said that the temple's going to be destroyed. When's it going to happen? Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. The end of what? Okay, the end of the temple and the end of the age associated with the temple. What are we not talking about? The end of time. The end of the world. We're not talking about that at all. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginnings of birth pangs. By the way, this is not unique language to this text. It's not even unique language to the parallel text here. These are things that are used all throughout the scriptures by the prophets to talk about tumultuous, difficult trials. These are just things that cause you to realize, wait a minute, this isn't going to be fun. Be on your guard. They will deliver you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before me. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. Again, what are we talking about? The end of the Jewish system, not the end of the world. Gospel hadn't been preached yet, but he says there's going to be a lot of turmoil. You're going to be dragged before councils. You're going to be beaten in the synagogues. You're going to, by the way, who asked him these questions? There's 4 of them named specifically, but they are representative of the 12. The apostles. You have to proclaim the gospel to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not for you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Those men, they were the ones that were inspired. I'm not inspired. Guess what I have to worry about? What I'm going to say. If I just stood up there every week and said whatever came off the top of my head, I'd be in trouble. Worse than that, you would be in trouble. This isn't talking about everyone. It's talking about a specific group of people under a specific set of circumstances that was going to take place at a specific period of time, not a specific day, but a specific period of time. We're going to see that more as we go on. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. By the way, this again is not unique language. This is used in the Old Testament prophets to describe periods of time where there is great turmoil and persecution that came against the people of Israel, when they were being judged by the nations, when the Assyrians were taking over the north tribes, when the Babylonians were taking over Judea and the southern tribes. This is the kind of language that's used to describe just how bad it got. In fact, in one place in 2 Kings, it got so bad that there's 2 women that make a deal with each other. Remember what the deal was? It's in 2 Kings chapter 6, I think. One of them says, hey, I tell you what, let's boil your son today and eat him. And then tomorrow we'll boil my son and we'll eat him. That's how bad it got. And he's simply saying what? By the way, that same context says that the head of an animal is going to be sold for a large sum of money, and even dove's dung is going to be sold and seen as valuable because things are going to be so bad. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Be faithful even unto death, and I'll give you a crown of righteousness. By the way, that general principle applies to every person in every generation. So these are the problems you're going to face. They ask the question, when's this going to happen? He says, look, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be happening. Be prepared for it and endure. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Are we going to be able to flee from the judgment of God at the end times? No. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house, nor take anything out, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. What's he saying there? Look, when this happens, when you see, by the way, I think this is talking about the armies that besieged the city of Jerusalem. When you see them there, you don't have time anymore to prepare. You don't go back to your house to collect your clothes and pack a bag. At this point, you do what? You run for the hills and you leave everything behind. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. What does that have to do with the end of the world? Well, nothing, but what does it have to do with traveling and running from an invading army? Well, a lot. It slows you down. Makes it much more difficult. Babies do something else that besides just need to eat. What else do? They cry. Anybody watch the television show MASH when it was on TV? Any of you guys that are young, you see the reruns? Great show. There's one episode that I think of every time I read that verse. And they're on a bus. And they are under bombardment. And the way it's played, actually, the character of Hawkeye is dealing with some problems that arose from having experienced these things. And the psychiatrist is working with him, and he's telling the story, and he's talking about this woman on the bus who has a chicken, and the chicken won't stop clucking, and eventually she smothers the chicken so that the chicken doesn't give them away. And it turns out that it wasn't a chicken at all, it was a baby. That's what he's talking about. Woe to those who have to deal with these additional problems as they're trying to flee and get away. Not only do they slow you down, but they give away your position. Because what babies don't know is when to be quiet. When do they make noise? The parents are going all the time. When they want something, irrespective of what's going on or where they're at. When they need something, they just cry. All right. What verse was that? There we go, verse 17. 18. Pray that it may not happen in winter. Again, what would it matter if we're talking about the coming of the Lord at the end of time, whether it's winter or summer? The reason it matters now is because if it happens in the winter, the fleeing is a whole lot more difficult and uncomfortable. By the way, this is important as well for a whole nother reason. Pray that it doesn't happen in the winter. Is Jesus saying, I'm telling you exactly when these things will happen and I'm giving you an exact timeline? No, he's saying it could be in the winter. It may not be in the winter. You better pray that it's not in the winter. Even at this point in the narrative, he's not saying, okay, you can check this sign off and check this sign off and check this sign off. And when these things have happened, then the end's here. He's saying that all these things are going to take place before the end comes. And what you better hope is that whenever the end comes, that it's at a time where it's more convenient for you to flee so you can deliver yourself. And by the way, the salvation being talked about here, it's not the salvation of the soul, but the salvation of what? The body. Because what happened to the people that were in Jerusalem when the Roman armies came in and destroyed Jerusalem? They killed them. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. Now that's very strong language. There had been a lot of terrible things that had happened. A lot of terrible stories. We mentioned it just a moment ago that 2 Kings talked about a period where people were boiling their children to eat. They were so hungry. And he says, it's never been as bad as it's going to be on that time, during that time. And it will never be that bad again. So think about the worst times that you've lived through. You didn't face what the first century Christians faced in Jerusalem. What they faced in Jerusalem was worse. If the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders. That's at least a second time that Jesus talked about signs and wonders being performed by people that were fake. He doesn't deny that the signs and wonders are worked. He denies that they're legitimate. They will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. Be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And that all sounds like nice, mystical, scary language, right? What does it mean? Anybody have any thoughts about what's being described there? The sun's being darkened, the moon's not going to give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Yeah, but is it intended to be literal? No. So what does it represent? Okay, rulers, nations, everything being... What happens every day? Every morning, what can we know is going to happen? The sun's going to rise. We know that's going to happen. And then what's going to happen at the end of the day? It's going to set and the moon's going to come out, and the stars are going to come out. And I'm as certain that that's going to happen as I am that I'm standing here right now. So if the sun doesn't shine and the moon and the stars don't give their light at night, if that's upset, then what is not upset? See, we're talking about foundational things. These are the bedrock of what we know. And he says, what we know to be, it's not going to happen. The earth will be shaken. Verse 26, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds of the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Okay, what's it describing? All right, before we go too far, let's go to Joel chapter 2 for a minute. Let's go to Joel chapter 2 for a minute. Blow a trumpet in Zion, it opens up. Sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. There's a phrase we might recognize, the day of the Lord. All right, let's skip down as he's talking about this, just for time's sake. Verse 9, they leap upon the city, they run upon the walls, they climb into the houses, they enter through the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon are darkened, the stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. He who executes his word is powerful, for the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it? You notice that language. The sun and the moon are darkened, the stars withdraw their shining. Same type language, right? We're going to have to skip some more again for time because I'm running low on. Look at verse 23, Joel 2. Be glad, O children of Zion, rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given the early rain for your vindication, has poured down for you abundant rain. The early and latter rain is before. The threshing floors shall be full of grain. The vats shall overflow with wine and oil. I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, the cutter, the great army which I sent. He's saying, I'm gonna undo the famine. You shall eat plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never again be put to shame. You shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and I am the Lord your God, and there is none else, and my people shall never again be put to shame. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit. 28 and 29, that sounds a little familiar to me. Anybody know where we read those words besides Joel chapter 2? Acts chapter 2. Peter, in his sermon, says, this is that of which Joel was speaking. So you want to know when these things are, when the day of the Lord that's being talked about here is? When the temple is going to be overturned? and the earth's going to quake, and the sun's not going to shine, and the stars are not going to give their light. It's the day of the Lord, when the gospel is preached and his kingdom is established. I'm not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of the law. He's talking about the end of nations being what's important. Doesn't matter anymore about the nations. What matters? The kingdom of heaven. And so we go back into Mark. He's going to gather his elect from the four winds. When did that happen? Well, it's ongoing, actually. Still ongoing as the gospel is preached to all the earth. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. When was Jerusalem going to be destroyed? When was the temple no longer going to be significant? When was the foundations of the earth to be shaken? When were the elect to be called from the four corners of the earth? He says, all this is going to happen in that generation. People he was talking to. In your lifetime, you're going to see all these things. So be ready and know when you've seen all this, my kingdom's here. I have come in my kingdom. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows. By the way, there's a lot of people who say, okay, there's a change right here, and now he's talking about the end of time. I don't even agree with that anymore. Concerning that day and hour, when is this going to actually happen? Well, just like he said about the destruction of Jerusalem, pray that it's not in the winter, and he wasn't giving them an exact timeline for these events. He's not giving an exact timeline for the coming. In fact, you'll recall at the end of the gospel, he tells his disciples to go and wait in Jerusalem until the Spirit falls upon them. Even then, he didn't tell them when it was going to happen or what day it was going to be. He's just told them it's going to be in their lifetime. So they need to be looking and they need to be ready. Not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his own work, commends the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Keep your eyes open for the kingdom, because the kingdom's coming. So can we pray thy kingdom come as a future event? No, we must pray what? It has come. Why? Because he said it was all going to happen in that generation. Didn't tell them exactly when it was going to happen. But he said all these things are going to happen in this generation while you're still alive. I'm not going to give you an exact day. I'm not going to give you an exact hour. I'm going to tell you to be looking and to be awake and to be prepared. And that is all that he's talking about. Nothing more complex than that. Nothing more mystical than that. So, anybody have any questions or comments? I'm out of time. All right. Thanks for your participation this morning.
Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.